Welcome back to Second Breakfast and our ongoing film discussions, bringing you the best thoughts, theories, and literary analysis this side of Stephen King's Misery. That's right, we're talking about Hurry Up Tomorrow today, the new film from The Weeknd. He co-wrote, he stars in, this film is all about him, he's playing himself. A lot of this conversation is going to be in conversation with The Idol, which is the series he did a couple years ago over on HBO, which we did an episode and we absolutely loved. We thought it was kind of a misunderstood, messy masterpiece. And I think there's a similar aura going into this project. It's kind of it's almost an abstract self-portrait. And that's where I want to start. It's just me today, by the way. Maggie couldn't make it for scheduling issues, so you'll have to make do with me. The film is messy. That's absolutely where I want to start. It is self-indulgent, it is derivative, it is way too long, and it kind of feels like marketing for the new album that The Weeknd released, which is also called Hurry Up Tomorrow, and just kind of marketing for him in general. But within that messiness and kind of performative introspection, a lot of crying, there are some nuggets of gold that I thought were worth an episode here, because I think this film comfortably and uncomfortably is sort of an avalanche of insights into the artistic life. I'm a writer, I'm a voice actor, I'm a comic artist, I'm all these other things that we've talked about kind of dotted throughout these discussions when it's relevant, and I think it kind of matters to this sort of discussion. The life of an artist is a lot of isolation and ego and fear, and I would argue that all three of those things in turn are sort of required for the work, and this film is almost stretching those ideas kind of to absurdity, and it makes the story, and especially The Weeknd's character, where he plays The Weeknd, it makes it kind of a boundless, navel-gazing project. And I identified with this in kind of an uncomfortable way. That's the first thing that popped into my head when I finished watching the movie was the film is embarrassing. But I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I mean that it's kind of a send-up and a confession and an exaggeration of something I recognize and identify with. It's the same way that I really hated when Girls was coming out. I loved that show, and I hated the kind of cross-pollination of people tarring and feathering Lena Dunham with the things her character was doing because she was so perfectly parodying what was going on in millennial culture where the show was embarrassing, but what she was doing was such a great skewering of it. I think there's some of that similar cross-pollination happening here, especially with The Weeknd playing himself in the film, because a lot of that artistic life that the film is about is incredibly, almost endlessly insular. It involves burrowing through your thoughts and memories with a pickaxe to try to develop ideas, in his case, to write music, to get himself hyped up to the point that he can perform at a professional level on this tour that we see dotted throughout the plot here. And I recognized some of that, some of those muscles that even, as a non-internationally touring, unbelievably famous and successful musician, it's a similar language, because the deeper you get into it, the farther you go out on that limb into your own mind, working on this project and trying to pick out these ideas from the ether, you can absolutely get lost. You can lose perspective, you can lose humility, your priorities can get completely skewed, and you end up with this sort of tunnel vision. And I think that's where this film, as it slides more and more into surrealism, I think that becomes the prevailing interest of the film, where any minor problem with his work, with his performance, becomes apocalyptic and all-consuming, and the world kind of skews to indulge that because he is so rich and powerful, so, important in his own world, that he's almost godlike in the way he can control circumstances around him. But it's almost like every scene takes place with a trapdoor under him, because I think another part of that artistic life is the sensation of writer's block, which I think you can extend through any artistic medium, any field. When you wake up one day and the muscles that you need to do your creative work aren't there, when it's just not happening that day, it's incredibly disorienting. It can feel like all of your senses are suddenly gone. All of your limbs have disappeared. It's it's an incredibly uncomfortable sensation. And I think when you react to that, the desperation that you bring to that struggle can kind of make you act in embarrassing ways. It can make you endlessly myopic. And I think the film, again, captures and exaggerates a lot of those ideas. An example sort of scene that I'm thinking of here is the beautiful shot of the Weeknd laying down against a wall, miserably composing his next song, kind of mumbling in a bathrobe, holding a keyboard. It reminded me so forcibly of that scene in Amadeus, that triumphant compositional explosion at the end of that film as he's dying. And I loved that this scene in Hurry Up Tomorrow was such a beautiful kind of pathetic shadow of that scene. It felt incredibly intentional to me while I was watching it. I almost wish the film had spent more time on that kind of creative process and the agony of that. I think it gets a little caught up in the imagery and the swirling beauty of the film. The whole thing's shot like a music video, but I think if it had been like 20 minutes shorter, that would have made more sense for me. It got a little long in the tooth. I think we got a little lost in the delirium through the course of this. I think it was an hour and 45 minutes. That said, the film looks beautiful. It's shot beautifully, and there are so many fantastic, memorable images. It very much reminded me of The Idol. I think visually we're pulling from that Sam Levinson sort of playbook. The swirling shots, the bleeding light, the color, that delirious sort of beauty. And there are plenty of other influences that seem to be all over this film. I noted in the beginning Stephen King's Misery, and of course the film with James Caan and Kathy Bates. I loved the way Hurry Up Tomorrow engaged Misery as kind of a jumping off point, because I even saw that in some of the marketing and the log lines, that it was this kind of riff on the Misery formula. But it very much strips down that plot to the basic skeleton and then remixes those fundamental elements. And it does so in an indirect way, to the point that it adds its own flair by pulling in other influences. There's a beautiful moment when Jenna Ortega is kind of waxing poetic about her favorite Weeknd songs while she has him tied up. And you feel like, okay, now the train has hit the tracks and we're going to run through the plot of Misery. But the way she waxes poetic about her favorite songs instead really reminds you of American Psycho and those endless monologues of Christian Bale talking about Huey Lewis and how almost sardonic and over the top and bubbly he is during those speeches. And Jenna Ortega rises to that beautifully. So we complicate all of the references. I think we're going beyond just this film is influential, and we're playing with it. It never felt like it was lazily leaning on the tropes of these classic films. Another example here, at the beginning when the Weeknd is walking out on stage, when we see him about to perform this concert, he's wearing this ornate boxing robe, and it frames Barry Keoghan's character as he's introduced as almost a coach. We assume that he's some sort of business manager, or, you know, he's in charge of kind of marshaling the Weeknd through this life of performing. And it almost frames him like Mickey, the trainer in the Rocky films. And that's such a great misdirection, because Barry Keoghan's character, as we go further into the film, he slowly starts to shed that admirable guise. He becomes darker and more enabling and manipulative. That you see the way that he's pushing and pulling and twisting the Weeknd as a character to serve his own ends. You know, anything he has to say to him and do for him to get out on stage and make them all more money. It really twists the knife, and it's a beautiful misdirection from that initial kind of feint towards him being an honorable mentor-like figure in Rocky. If Barry Keoghan's character had had more screen time here, I think he could have ascended to that role of almost wicked Shakespearean advisor. I'm thinking of characters like Iago from Othello, or Gertrude, or Polonius from Hamlet. I think we could have gotten there, but he really just wasn't in the film that much. And back to that kind of central thematic through line, I think evoking something like Rocky is incredibly effective if this film is viewed as kind of a send-up of that self-made, successful artist paradigm, that bootstraps thing that Sylvester Stallone kind of lived through the Rocky experience. The other main influence that I saw through this film was Stanley Kubrick. I think once we fall into the Misery plotline and Jenna Ortega has the Weeknd locked up in the hotel, we get these kind of flyaway sequences where after he's knocked out, he's kind of wandering through his dreams and his psyche and his subconscious, and he's doing that through the guise of this hotel, which increasingly becomes the Overlook. I think that's fairly plain and on its face. But again, the visual style of the film twists it and adds to it. It becomes more of a surreal work of horror than I think The Shining is ever really interested in. We transcend the domestic drama and go much more into the esoteric place through this lens of deep-fried, beautiful film grain. And there's the way the color and the light is done in that hotel. It almost reminds me of the way David Fincher will light and set his movies, and reminded me that through line of that Fincher-esque lighting is what I liked so much in The Idol, but it's taken to this burned out, kind of miserable, unlivable extreme in both of these projects. I enjoy the way the film gathers up all of its influences and pushes them all further, kind of tries to stretch them to their limits. And there's one example here, there's one scene that I think exemplifies everything I'm trying to say about this movie. So Maggie and I saw this film yesterday, which is would have been Wednesday at the time of recording, and it was called a fan event screening, so I'm not sure if this is exactly the experience you're going to have when the film fully comes out on Friday. But our showing started with a full sequence of the Weeknd walks in. We don't know the name of his character. We don't know what's going on. A guy walks in, played by the Weeknd, sits at a piano, starts playing a song. And slowly through the course of this song, you see the set change around him and things start to evolve and burn out. And the light and color change around him. And the whole time I was watching this sequence, parsing it for character beats, trying to learn what the lyrics meant to the character. I was grafting all of these ideas and creative choices in the execution of the song, the creation of the song, the creation of the instruments. I was reading all of those as character beats. I was hunting for exposition when I was just watching a musical performance. And I was admiring that as, hey, this feels like a really innovative way to introduce a narrative and make us look at art a little differently. We don't usually look at music in that way as the beginning of a movie. But then the whole thing stops. The song finishes, and an ad flashes on the screen for the Weeknd's new album, which is called Hurry Up Tomorrow. I don't know if this is intended to be the beginning of the film or if this was some sort of bonus content that Alamo Drafthouse strapped onto the movie at the beginning of this early screening. But the fact that it came before the movie started, I had to flush the toilet in my head and almost erase everything I'd just seen. And I think that was kind of emblematic of the whole experience, where the film gives you a lot to chew on, but there are these weird, kind of regular rug pull moments where the movie kind of shifts gears and feels like a pop-up ad for the Weeknd's career. And it's sort of impossible to tell how much of this is self-parody, how much of this is self-advertising. It's tricky, but I think digging through that murkiness is fairly rewarding as a moviegoer. And something that kind of tips me and my hunch about this film towards it being more self-conscious and more self-critical than it is self-indulgent is the restraint shown by the ending of the film. And I'm going to try to vaguely spoil it here. I don't want to totally ruin the thing right as it comes out, but I really admired how ambiguous the ending of the film stayed, because I think that retains a lot of the depth. A really messy, esoteric, increasingly surreal, almost biopic self-portrait needs to be. I think to keep that from being just mindless self-indulgence, I think you do need to be more indirect about it, and the ending of the film being ambiguous does that. You can read it as this whole interaction between the Weeknd and Jenna Ortega was just a dream. You can totally read it that she was a figment of his imagination, and almost because their conversations become so intimate and such an interrogation of his psyche, I think you could read her entire character as an expression of his own self-obsession and self-loathing, kind of in turn there. You can also read the entire film as everything happens on its face. We go through the misery thing. This is like a worst-case scenario for a touring musician. And mild spoiler alert, I guess you can interpret the violent imagery at the end of the film as him dying. But even then, as we twist back to the concert footage, maybe he can't even escape after death the cycle of being this trapped touring musician, and we kind of descend into a purgatory of the repetition of his life. You can read it a bunch of different ways, and I think all of those are valid and interesting. I'm excited for the film to come out so I can see how everyone else is reading it, but I enjoyed kind of splitting off in my head in a bunch of different ways and being happy with where I ended up with each different interpretation. And that's where I want to end here, because Hurry Up Tomorrow is a movie I grappled with. I feel like I recognized in comfortable and uncomfortable ways. It's a film I'm chewing on and has lingered with me since I saw it, and that's kind of all I can ask for from a work of art. I think this is a very interesting companion piece to The Idol, and I was really impressed to see The Weeknd kind of jumping the fence and playing the other role here. Instead of being the tormenting, scheming manager, he's flipping the script and he's playing that sort of insecure artist. And I like taking these works together with how much they are together about the creative process. I think what it has to say there is more interesting than anything it has to say about fame. I think this film, it struck me in an interesting way. I think I saw it and understood it more than I was expecting. And I liked it as this messy, uncomfortable, kind of self-loathing and self-indulgent expression of an artistic life through this increasingly absurdist lens. I think it was an interesting, almost parody as much as it was a self-portrait. I think it was embarrassing in the grossness of its confession. And I found that incredibly engaging in a work of art. So thank you very much. Please let me know what you thought of this film. I'm excited for the conversation, for the kind of discourse that's going to go around this film, because I think it has a lot to say, and I'm excited to see how fractal the reception of it becomes. If you haven't already, we did do an episode on The Idol when that came out. We had a lot to say about that. I think that's one of our stronger discussions about TV. And on our Patreon, we have a whole back catalog of bonus episodes for you to check out. This month is our 5-year anniversary, so we're doing bonus episodes every single week over there. We did an episode pulling together a bunch of David Cronenberg movies, including his new film, The Shrouds. That was a great conversation. We did a breakfast buffet roundup about 3 Jack White concerts we saw in the last 6 months as part of his latest No Name tour. And as a little preview through the rest of this month, we're about to do a deep dive into Doom 2016 and the evolution of the FPS genre. And then we're going to do another breakfast buffet roundup about the Captain America series through the lens of Steve and Bucky's relationship. We had a lot of fun prepping for all of those. So thank you for checking out the Patreon. Thank you for listening to the episode. You can also check out my latest book, Lemon Tarts in Space. It is a rip-roaring sci-fi adventure through space and time that is also increasingly introspective and uncomfortably personal, and it's kind of about cancer. It's very much Ridley Scott's Alien meets Monty Python filtered through my own brain and, again, pickaxing through as much gray matter as I could reach. The book is available as a paperback, ebook, or a fully produced and acted audio drama. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back here in just a few days with another brand new episode.